Men are disappearing, but not in the ways that we are used to measuring, not suddenly, not through crisis. They're disappearing from everyday participation, from dinner tables, friendships, work, from the routines that once anchored them. And we tend to only notice when men leave society when they do it extremely. Well, it shows up in suicide statistics, crime figures, viral moments of crashing out. But these moments aren't the beginning of the story, they're really just the end of one. And long before that, something much quieter happens. Invitations stop being accepted, work drifts into absence, social lives thin until there's no one left to call. This isn't a backlash, it isn't about blame, and it isn't some zero-sum argument where in order for us to talk about men, we must somehow take away from women. It's about what happens when a society changes faster than large numbers of men are helped to adapt, and the consequences of letting that go unnoticed. Because when men disappear quietly, the cost doesn't stay with them, it stays with everybody. So this week I'm looking at what I'm calling the masculinity recession and how a certain group of men are quietly withdrawing from society and what that means for the rest of us. Now, when we talk about men being in crisis, what often happens is we tend to see it as like a mood. Men are not doing as well. And if that was the case with this piece that I'm talking about this week, it might be easier to ignore. But evidence points to something far more serious, that there's a widespread collapse in men's social life that is measurable, persistent, and increasingly lethal. Let's start with the most confronting statistic. In the latest UK suicide data, men account for 3/4 of all suicide deaths, a pattern that has never gone away for the last 30 to 40 years. And according to figures from the Samaritans, the male suicide rate for men is 17 deaths per 100,000 compared to just 5 with women. To put that another way, 14 men will kill themselves today and 14 men will kill themselves tomorrow and every other day just in the UK. And while that's a horrible statistic, what I think is most striking and what I think most people aren't aware of is who is exactly at risk. Because the highest suicide rate among men isn't among teenage boys or young men, it's actually among men aged 50 to 54, where rates of suicide rise from 17 per 100,000 to 27 per 100,000. This is a generation most likely to have believed in a stable social contract, working hard, provide, be dependable, be reliable, and meaning and a good life will find its way to you. I think that's completely dissolved, and I think that's why this group of men have become the biggest losers, or the most likely to sort of fall out of society as a result of what's happened. But as I mentioned in the intro, looking at suicide is really just the sharpest point of a much broader pattern, I think. Long before men reach a crisis point, they're already seeing their lives stripped of close connection. Recent UK research published by Belonging Forum points out that male friendship is in a dire crisis. So one in 10 men have no close friends at all. And among this 50 to 64 age group, that rises to 15%. And 27% of men say they have no close friends they could rely on at a time of crisis. That's terrible. These are not marginal numbers. They represent millions of men moving through adulthood without emotional backup. No one to call when a relationship ends, or a job disappears, or their health starts to fail. The danger here is not just loneliness, but sort of a silent loneliness. And the reason why I say that is because men are way more likely to need help when they go through crisis, but are less likely to reach out. They're less likely to talk about it, and are less likely to find the way to the people that can help them, doctors, medical staff, and things like that. And data from the NHS shows that men are way less likely than women to access psychological therapies or mental health services, but they are 3 times more likely to die from themselves. And this gap between distress and disclosure is where I think the masculinity crisis really lies. Clinicians and researchers often describe this as a form of learned stoicism, that from an early age we must absorb the message that pain should be managed privately, that competence should be proved through endurance, and vulnerability treated as a personal failure. And the result is, it's not resilience, but isolation. Men do not lack the emotional depth that they're constantly hit with. They lack permission and practice to embody that, to live within it. And I think what makes this particularly dangerous is that the traditional buffers against isolation have also been eroded. Workplaces are less stable, neighbourhoods are less coherent, families are more geographically dispersed and held by fewer forces to keep them together. Not that that's anyone's fault, it's just an observation. And I think when friendship networks start to thin as well, as they often do after midlife, especially for men, there's just nothing holding these men together. There's nothing holding these men away from the abyss. And I think this is how people die of quiet, as I'm calling it. Not all at once and not always dramatically. First, the invitations stop. Then the routines disappear. And eventually the idea that anyone would notice if you vanished starts to sort of come true for you. By the time a crisis arrives, the scaffolding that might have held it back has already gone. To understand why so many men are drifting into isolation, I think we have to move beyond psychology and look squarely at the broader world that sits around them. It's not simply a crisis of confidence or a lack of communication. It is, I think, at its core, a crisis of expectations colliding with reality. Let me explain. In late 2024, the research organisation More in Common published a massive piece of research on trust, identity, and social cohesion. And across the data sets they looked at, one group appeared again and again and again: middle-aged men, especially those that live outside of London, especially those that don't hold a degree, and especially those who are increasingly convinced that the system no longer works for them. More in Common research described these men as disillusioned, not radicalised, not reactionary, just disappointed. They were men who believed they did what was asked of them and they still fell behind. In the group's research, around 70% of those men agreed with the following statements: no matter how hard I work, I will struggle to get ahead. Large majorities of people felt ignored by politicians, misrepresented by media, and looked down on by a culture that no longer seemed to have a place for them. The dominant emotion wasn't rage, it was a kind of quiet futility. And I think this sense of betrayal is rooted in a broken promise. For much of the 20th century, masculinity in Britain was tightly bound to a simple equation: stable work equals dignity, purpose and respect. Men were not promised wealth, but they were promised usefulness. And if you show up and you contribute, you would earn a life that felt coherent. And I think that promise has collapsed, especially for this group. Policy researcher Richard Reeves, he hangs around on YouTube, he's well worth watching. He's long argued that men have been uniquely exposed by the economic transition from an industrial economy to a service-based one. In his book of Boys and Men, which is great, everyone should read it, Reeves shows that jobs that once rewarded physical strength and routine competence, manufacturing, extraction, transport, have steadily declined or become precarious. The jobs that are growing fastest now sit in sectors that prize interpersonal skills, credentials, and emotional labour. Reeves describes this as the heel gap, or jobs that are around health, education, administration, and literacy. These are the fields that are growing the fastest in modern advanced economies, but are the fields that men are the least likely to enter. And as traditionally male-dominated jobs start to disappear, women have, on average, migrated into new sectors far easier than men have. And I think that's led to a lot of men just falling out of the labour market altogether. In the UK, hundreds of thousands of working-age men are now economically inactive. with long-term sickness being the most common reason why. It's important to state that while ill health is real, researchers have noted that economic inactivity and psychological distress often reinforce one another. Once work disappears, routines erode, confidence drops, and our ability to re-enter the workforce becomes harder with every passing year. And I think this really matters, especially for men, because work has been one of the primary ways men accessed social interactions. Jobs weren't just paychecks, they were places where friendships formed, where identities stabilized, and where days were given structure. When work goes, men don't only lose income, they lose community and status, and a clear answer to the question, what am I even for? The masculinity recession isn't driven by men refusing to adapt. It is driven by a society that dismantled the old pathways to purpose without building new ones that men could realistically step into. The result is a growing population of men who feel surplus to requirements, present, but no longer necessary. And I think when people feel that they're no longer necessary, well, withdrawal begins to look like a pretty reasonable response to what's going on. So if economic displacement explains the shock, culture explains why so many men struggle to recover. For decades, researchers have warned that masculinity operates inside a narrow emotional corridor, one that rewards control, stoicism, and self-reliance while punishing things like vulnerability and dependence. At Equimundo, a research company, they've given this framework a name. They're calling it the man box. And it's a rigid set of expectations that defines what a real man is allowed to feel, say, and be. The rules are pretty simple, pretty familiar to anyone watching this who is part of this group. Don't cry, be strong, be a provider, solve problems alone, show competence, not confusion. These norms are often mistaken for tradition or toughness, but research suggests they come at a measurable cost. And other studies led by Equimundo again across multiple countries have consistently found that men who most strongly conform to these man box norms are more likely to engage in risky behaviour, experience depression, use violence, and even die by suicide, and most of all, less likely to seek help when they most need it. In other words, the very traits that many men were taught that would protect them are now actively undermining their survival. The man box becomes especially punishing in moments of economic or relational loss, when a man can no longer fulfill the provider role through redundancy, illness, or automation. There is often no culturally sanctioned backup identity to fall into. Caregiver, learner, community builder. Sure, these roles absolutely exist, but they have not been historically offered to men with the same sense of legitimacy or support. And what replaces purpose for these men who feel they've nowhere else to go is shame. And shame helps explain a paradox at the heart of the masculinity recession, I think. That men are not only lonely, they're really bad at repairing their loneliness. When friendships drift or dissolve, many men lack both the language and the social muscle memory to repair them. And reaching out will feel awkward and weird, or naming a need feels humiliating, or silence just becomes safer than exposure. And there's also a practical dimension that rarely gets discussed here. Men tend to bond through shared activity rather than conversation alone. Sociologists have long known this, that male friendships are often maintained shoulder to shoulder rather than face to face. Things like work, sport, hobbies are way more likely to foster connection and intimacy with men than just face-to-face emotional disclosure. I see it in my practice all the time. Men find therapy really hard because it's not because they're emotionally deficient, it's because they were taught a different social architecture. And the problem is that the structures that once enabled this type of bonding are completely disappearing. Working men's pubs are closing. Pubs, problematic as they are, also closing. Local sports leagues struggle to raise funding. As these third places start to erode, men lose the scaffolding that made connection feel natural rather than forced. And without an activity to organise around, many simply stop showing up. Researchers who have been looking at masculinity for a really long time, especially with loneliness, have noted that this loss of social infrastructure hits men way harder than it hits women. Women, on average, maintain relationships more directly through conversation and emotional check-ins, whereas men often rely on institutions or big structural things to do that work for them. When those institutions disappear, those relationships often go with them. For younger men, meanwhile, this absence is increasingly filled by digital spaces, online gaming communities, financial speculation forums, and algorithm-driven manosphere content, which I've spoken about a lot before. But while they can create something that feels holding, it no longer guarantees status, rules, progression, and a sense of belonging. These spaces can feel communal, even intimate at times, but they rarely provide care. And they often rely on conflict being amplified or vulnerability being punished and connection being performative. And what I've noticed in these groups is there is this sort of phantom community, a sense of togetherness without protection, identity without accountability. It can temporarily numb loneliness, and I'm not bashing online communities. I think they play a really important part for many men and women, but it doesn't resolve the thing that I'm talking about. The cultural crisis facing men is not that masculinity has been attacked, it is that it has been left unfinished. The old scripts no longer work, but we don't have any new ones that have been fully written and widely supported. Until men are offered identities that allow for usefulness, interdependence, and growth without shame, I think this retreat will just continue. Escaping the man box is not about rejecting masculinity, quite the opposite, in fact. I think it's about expanding it so that when one role collapses, a life doesn't have to collapse along with it. If the masculinity recession was only a story about decline, it would already be pretty overwhelming. But the data suggests something more complicated and more hopeful is emerging beneath this panic. And despite relentless headlines about the lost boys and online misogyny, younger men are not, on the whole, turning away from equality or progress. Quite the opposite, in fact. Survey data from YouGov, which is based in the UK, consistently shows that most young men in the UK broadly hold egalitarian views on gender roles, relationships, and women's rights, while only a small minority express admiration for hyper-masculine dickheads, insert figures, they are just that. They are a minority. Estimates regularly place this group in the low teens, not the mainstream. The problem then is not about values, it's about viability. Young men are often way more emotionally open than their dads are. They're more comfortable rejecting rigid gender roles and more supportive of shared caregiving. What they lack, I think, are stable pathways into adulthood that make those lives livable. Housing, way too expensive. Work, too precarious. Community, too thin. Equality without infrastructure still leaves people stranded. And what applies to young men also applies to young women too. And this is why I think some of the best examples I've seen of countering the masculinity recession are not based around scolding men for being better. It's about practical rebuilds, efforts to restore the conditions under which men can form bonds, can feel useful and belong without an apology or a permission slip. One of the best examples I've seen is the men's shed movement. Now, this was something that started out in Australia years ago. It now has turned up in the UK, and I think it's in a bunch of other countries too. And these men's sheds are super simple by design. They are shared spaces where men, often older, retired, or socially isolated, come together to build, repair, and make things. Conversation happens naturally, but it's not the point. Purpose is. Evaluations of the work that men's sheds have done for men have repeatedly shown that when men go to these things and tinker or make stuff or whatever it is they do, they've shown improvements in mental well-being, a renewed sense of identity among participants, reduced loneliness, And these benefits, and this is a really important point, like if you're listening to this and you make these decisions, is really important to understand. These men got better without forcing emotional disclosure. Men connect because they are needed, not because they are opened up, in my view. And this model helps us understand a broader idea that men do not need to be fixed, they just need to be included. And at the policy level, we are starting to see tentative signs that this reality is beginning to land. There has been way more attention around youth unemployment, long-term economic inactivity, and men's disengagement from education. Suggests that finally we're starting to recognise that large numbers of boys and men are falling through the cracks that were never redesigned for them to be held. And investigations into what are being called NEETs, or young people not in education, employment or training, increasingly recognise that young men are disproportionately represented in this group, and that just moralising about motivation has, guess what, done nothing to reverse the trend. Reinventing masculinity does not mean resurrecting the 1950s. Don't believe that what happened back then, A, is possible, or B, provided men what they need today. I think it means expanding the range of respectable male lives on offer. It means valuing caregiving, mentorship, craftsmanship, and community contributions alongside proper paid work. It means recognising fatherhood not just as a provision, but as a presence. And it means rebuilding the social infrastructure that once held men in place. Clubs, workshops, teams, shared projects, the things that allow men to form bonds without having to articulate that they're lonely first. The masculinity recession is not going to end by telling men to talk more or feel less shame or adapt faster. Trust me, I've sat in many therapy rooms with many clients and heard that being discussed. These problems, these solutions rather, assume that the problem is just you, guy on your own, it's your failure, everyone else is doing fine. Quite the opposite, in fact. The recession ends when we stop treating men as defective women who just need better emotional skills and start designing a society in which men can once again be useful, connected, and valued on their own terms. Until then, the absence of men will continue to grow, I think.